Trade and war. You can see in this chart the rise of manufacturing from the early 18th century to the mid 19th century. But you can also see the faster growth of commerce, trade, between states. So we're going to take a look at the relationship between trade, peace, and war. A relationship which is somewhat complicated. Liberals argue that trade between states enhances peace, whereas mercantilists argue that trade can cause war. Both arguments are true under certain circumstances. Trade and peace. The theoretical link between trade and peace is expounded principally from within the liberal trade theory. It was argued as far back as the 18th century by Adam Smith, Montesquieu, and Ricardo. During England's industrialization, the advocacy of free trade was forwarded by the Manchester liberals. Richard Cobden and John Stuart Mill argued that free trade brings harmony of interests because it separates the pursuit of wealth from territory, thereby making it unnecessary to conquer foreign sources of raw materials or finished goods. Trade is cheaper because it's cheaper than war, or the occupation of an unwilling society. As well, trade permitted states to specialize in trade for those goods they were best at producing and receiving in turn inexpensive products from other states with similar specialization. This form of comparative advantage made all participating states better off because it pushed product prices down. Therefore, wealth is more easily obtained than war. When war is cheaper or easier, it is pursued instead. Now, trade reduces the likelihood of war by structurally altering the societies that engage in trade. Trade, according to Barrington Moore, creates a middle class that resists involvement in war more strongly than other domestic socioeconomic groups. Capitalism and free trade increases individual liberty and helps promote democracy, which in turn promotes the rule of law and international cooperation, which further encourages international trade. The current array of international institutions are built to sustain this liberal trade philosophy and are mainly designed to ensure no recurrence of a trade collapse similar to the 1930s depression, which it was widely believed was the cause of the subsequent Second World War. This is a map of foreign investment, and you can see the four color codes: the UK, the French, the Germans, and the Americans. And what this is meant to illustrate is to counter the Marxist claim that much of the exploitation of capitalism was targeted at the weaker, undeveloped states that were exploited, and it was this exploitation that kept them poor. If you see here, most of the investment went to other developed areas. So the British invested heavily in North America, including the Canada and the US, heavily into Central America, particularly Brazil, heavily in South Africa, but somewhat less in, say, Japan, China, or Africa. You can also see the British investment in Australia. The Germans invested in Eastern Europe, particularly Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and heavily in the United States, Mexico, and Brazil. The French invested heavily in Russia and the Ottoman Empire, South America, also Mexico and the US, and less so in the developing world. The US invested in Mexico, but also back in Europe. So we go back to Kindleberger's theory and add a few additional elements on the link between depression and World War II. So the 1929 stock market crash followed by the Depression was generally seen as a severe and undesirable event. Everyone became poorer, though no one wanted to. The US economy depended on loan payments from Europe, specifically to France and Britain, who'd engaged the loans as part of their effort to win World War I. Now these in turn obtained their funds from German war reparations. And Germany obtained its income to pay for the reparations from trade with the US. Now, when the stock market crashed, there was a rush to protect labor, specifically employment, and so tariffs were put up to bar cheaper foreign goods being dumped on the market. The effect of this, the Smoot-Hawley Act of June 1930 in the U.S., was to actually reduce trade between the states. That meant that Germany couldn't get the export income to pay reparations to England and France. England and France then couldn't repay the loans to the U.S. banks. And then the U.S. banks started to collapse in serial. So again, we have what was a normal business cycle recession turn into a major depression because of the absence of the hegemons. Because there was a failure to recognize that blocking trade by increasing tariffs basically imperiled the cycle that operated the whole system, that allowed the states to specialize. And ultimately, the stock market crash of 1929 turned into a long, deep depression, which brought extremist parties into powers of authority that ultimately pursued war. Here you can see the impact on the depression in the top graph, showing the dramatic rise of unemployment, particularly in Germany and the US. You can see in the lower chart the drop in demand for primary products. You can see the rise of world unemployment, almost 30% of households. You can also see world commodity production and the dramatic drop in prices. That's deflationary, which is bad. Here you can see the drop in industrial production, wages and salaries, and farm cash income. And below, you can see the dramatic rise in votes for the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, in the Reichstag elections. So you can see how employment in Germany between 1928 and 1936 correlates with voting support for the Nazi Party. You can see the Nazi Party in brown in the Second Reichstag only had 32 seats. And then in the Third Reichstag they had 14 seats, and that was further depressed in the Fourth Reichstag to 12 seats. It was a very marginal party. But then, after the stock market crash, their seats jumped to 107 deputies in 1930. We can see that in 1932 they were a third of the seats. And this increased again in 1932 further in the runoff election. And then finally, they were almost half of all the deputies, 288 out of 647, in the 8th Reichstag. And the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany led to the Nazi foreign policy becoming the foreign policy of Germany that ultimately led to the Second World War. Now, before the Second World War was even finished, the United States and England set about establishing a post-war international set of institutions to facilitate trade. With the memory of the failure of the League of Nations, the United Nations came into effect with 29 members on October 24th, 1945. It had 5 permanent members, the US, USSR, China, France, and England. More than for anything else, the United Nations was established to support those institutions, such as the World Bank, and attempts at liberalized global trade to avert the conditions that would put other militaristic political parties into power. These new institutions consisted of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. These were grounded on the Bretton Woods Agreement, signed in 1944, that facilitated currency transfers to facilitate trade. The principal goal of the World Bank was to implement development in the developing world, and thereby bring them into the trading process. The World Trade Organization was originally the GATT, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, signed in 1947, and periodically renegotiated, and sought the controlled reduction of tariffs between the world's states. These economic organizations were grounded on the assumption that peace could be facilitated by having states make trade rather than war, and increasing general prosperity so that middle classes could form into democratic states. So you see here the dramatic rise in expanding world trade between 1931 and 1991 in the valuation of exports. Now there's some criticisms over this. The first is that politics structures trade. The Western goal, for example, of keeping the Middle Eastern oil states from unifying is implicit. It's designed to keep the price of oil low and to disable attempts at successful cartels. The one thing the Middle East lacks is a hegemon. Almost every other region has a major state which is able to organize the other states. But the Middle East in particular has endless antagonisms. And so it's possible that the general disruption in the Middle East is not anything indigenous. It might be that the Middle East is a victim of great power politics. There might be a regional factor at play. Number two, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe indicates that outright military occupation of foreign lands is not necessarily more expensive than trade. This is especially true of industrial societies where the occupation of modern urban people and control through a totalitarian police state makes resistance nearly impossible. Chinese control of Hong Kong, Soviet control of Eastern Europe, and Nazi control of most of the states they conquered was actually fairly easy. In fact, Germany's occupation of France was cheaper than the benefits it got by extracting reparations through forced industrial processes to support the war effort for Germany. Czechoslovakia was an extreme case. It put up almost no resistance, which is why the English organized the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, to get the Germans to repress the Czechs and then to reduce productivity there. So you can conquer foreign societies if you're not a democracy. If you are a democracy, it's quite problematic to occupy foreign societies. Eastern Europe ultimately achieved independence and radical changes of government when the Soviet Union chose not to reinvade, as they did in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and Hungary in 1956. So what's the statistical evidence? Well, trade reduces conflict both dyadically and overall within a system, controlling for geographic contiguity, balance of power, alliance bonds, and economic growth. Ceteris paribus, meaning other things being equal, countries with the greatest levels of economic trade engage in the least amount of hostile interaction. Doubling the level of trade on average decreases the level of hostility and conflict by 20%. The more inelastic, meaning the demand does not decrease because of basic requirements, the more inelastic the imports and exports between two states, the less likely they are to be in a conflict. However, while trade reduces conflict, it does not increase cooperation. Furthermore, with preferential trade barriers, such as NAFTA, reducing tariffs, increasing trade, and reducing the likelihood of war by making trade losses in war explicit, they paradoxically increase interdependence, which may be a cause of war, as we're going to see next. Trade and war. So here's a puzzle. If trade causes peace, then why did the First World War occur when the world had unprecedented trade levels, particularly between the English and the Germans? Skeptics of the trade-peace link argue that while overall trade levels may bring peace, differing levels of symmetric and asymmetric interdependence and dependence can cause war. This comes mostly from the research of Catherine Barbieri. These are her formula. She's got equations rather. There's a trade share, salience, symmetry, and interdependence. And they're basically measuring the balance of trade and the levels of dependence between two trading partners. Barbieri used the correlates of war data set, and she found some important exceptions to the link between trade and peace. First, extremes in symmetric and asymmetric interdependence lead to increased disputes. And second, medium symmetric interdependence leads to peace. This is Barbieri's very well-known graph, and you can see here the probability of a dispute, and it goes from 0 up to 45%. or probability of 0.45. This is trade share for state I, and it goes from nothing to 100%. And this is trade share J. And so the way we interpret the chart is we locate the level of trade dependence. So let's assume that they each trade 50% of the time. So we can see here in the center there's a bit of a rise, a ridge. So there's a slight rise of dispute because they're more dependent on each other than if they were only trading 20%, and they'd be less likely to trade. But what if one country is 90% dependent and the other country is only 10%? Then we would follow this line here, which would go up to here. And you're looking at a very high likelihood of a dispute. And if the countries are mutually at 90%, we're looking at somewhere around here. So being mutually dependent is less serious than being asymmetrically dependent, which is much more likely. Now there are some computing studies. There's one study that found that dependence increases peace, in fact, not war. This is from Geller and Singer. Probably because the most dependent states are simply too weak to initiate conflicts. So there's sort of an ecological factor here. Another study finds that trade interdependence does not affect the incidence of war, only the incidence of disputes including war, and that extreme symmetric and asymmetric trade interdependence leads to increased number of disputes. Another alternative explanation argues that while states that traded made war in 1914, none that had significant foreign direct investment did, as this was a relationship between the colonial power and the colonies only. However, today, foreign direct investments supplement trade between major powers, so it may be a major disincentive to war. Albert Hirschmann did a study of Germany's trade with Eastern and Central Europe in the 1920s and 30s to reveal how dependence could be used for power politics. So there's two types of effects in foreign trade. The first is the supply effect. This is when a country is exporting strategic goods like oil or strategic minerals. This is often what we think of as power in trade. But Hirschmann identifies a second type of power, which he calls the influence effect. This is when a country has a very powerful market, which other countries want access to, and it can deny them access to that market, thereby disrupting their domestic economies and their domestic populations and having an electoral effect on their leaders. So the greater the benefits, the greater the dependency in a trading relationship. So in a bilateral trade relationship, you can increase prices, you can affect costly production methods, you can affect exports if you are the market. So what happened was Germany used the power of its market to influence the politics of countries in Eastern Europe. So Germany had relations, mostly in the form of agricultural trade, where Poland and Hungary would export to the German market, and Czechoslovakia would export minerals and finished goods. And this was a policy that was, in some ways, quite aggressive and was normal for Germany. In fact, the Weimar government practiced this. Now, Nazi Germany based its own free trade policy on the same program, within the historical context of mercantilism, which is to use strategic use of trade to obtain greater relative gains, including influence. Its principal implication is that free trade is not free trade, rather it's the method of obtaining monopolization, and therefore affecting the structure of trade so that states obtain favorable terms of exchange. So mercantilists are preoccupied with accumulating the necessary resources for war, which is what Nazi Germany did. Mercantilism explains why states do not rely on the free market, but engage in industrial policies to ensure that they retain a base of manufacturing strength. And so they seek to corner oil or uranium or phosphate production regions. So what Nazi Germany did was it opened up its market. It allowed states in Eastern Europe, particularly during the Depression, to get privileged access to the German market, and then Germany abruptly threatened to close its market to individual states. And allowed them to continue to trade if they changed their actual foreign policy and their politics. And then ultimately to sell goods to the German market more cheaply. So Germany was threatening a shock to the domestic populations of these countries by abruptly cutting off trade at a time when these countries had few other choices for markets. Now, in the US, there was, of course, a debate between mercantilists and free traders. Thomas Jefferson wanted to pursue free trade and commerce with the entire world. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, believed in strong state support for manufacturing through import substitution industrialization, where infant industries are protected by high tariffs, and the restriction against the export of strategic raw minerals that could be used in war. In Germany, before it was unified, you had an influential person called Friedrich List. This was a nationalist German who was eventually expelled from Germany under Prussian pressure because of his nationalist views. So he went to the US, became a wealthy business person, and ultimately was sent back to Germany with diplomatic protection as the American ambassador. He had a very mercantilist view and ultimately shaped foreign policy. He argued that Germany needed to unify, create a common customs union, and through that mercantilist technique it could then have the power to influence its neighbors. In fact, Friedrich List was the most influential ideologue for many of the Nazis because he ultimately advocated an American manifest destiny model, which was you need to first create a state and then you need to occupy empty land and make it your own. And he was copying the American expansion into the West and the relocation of the indigenous tribes and the push to the Pacific. For Germany, which was to be a push into Russia and to implement policies there to take control of the region. Trade and interdependence. It also matters upon what resources a state is dependent. Strategic commodities that are necessary for the survival of the state are likely to produce a different behavior by that state than non-critical resources. Dependence should be classified more clearly between sensitivity and vulnerability. Sensitivity is when you suffer costs but you can compensate. Vulnerability is when it's much more difficult to compensate or replace the missing product. The high level of trade between England and Germany just prior to the First World War was affected by the fact that Germany was vulnerable to a cutoff, particularly of foodstuffs, oil, chromium, rubber, and most of that came from the British Empire. Germany, aware of its dependence and fearful of a British embargo, decided to build a fleet to challenge a possible future British embargo and developed war plans not to invade Holland, knowing that Holland could serve as a neutral port for strategic imports from other countries. Germany's trade dependence therefore did not decrease conflict but led to greater preparations for war and ultimately contributed to conflict escalation during the July 1904 crisis that led to the First World War. You can see here a list of some of the strategic goods in the First World War. This is another list of goods, and it specifies its use and the location of where these resources came from. This is a list of oil supplies and where they came from at different points during the Second World War. However, dependence is not a sufficient cause of war. If it were, Germany's high trade dependence on England would have led it to go to war 30 years earlier than it did in 1914. So it doesn't always explain the timing of war. That's probably better explained by politics. So let's look now at Copeland's theory of trade expectations in interdependence and war. We looked at Copeland's theory of balance of power in the balance of power lecture earlier. Copeland argues that high interdependence can be either peace-inducing or war-inducing depending on the expectations of future trade, meaning what benefits do you anticipate to get in the future from trade. Interdependence fosters peace, as the liberals argue, but only when trade levels are expected to be high in the foreseeable future. Low expectations of future benefits from a highly interdependent relationship can lead to war, because the most highly developed states may come to believe that the use of military force will provide an easier means of obtaining the economic wealth to support their long-term security. I'd like to further unpack Copeland's argument by putting in the context of the larger debate. Copeland identifies 4 conventional wisdoms and the flaws that exist within each. The first are the defensive realists. Defensive realists argue that states will stop trading if it gives power to another state. And so it's essentially a relative gains issue. So defensive realists are concerned about the ranking of a state relative to others, and it's not going to give away an advantage easily. And defensive realism is tied in with the trade security dilemma, which is the danger that the two countries get into a spiral of mistrust, which can not only lead to an arms race of militaries and large navies, but also lead to an increase in tariffs and a general ending of trade between the two states. And this is evident in countries like India, Pakistan after the first Indo-Pakistan War in 1947. The problem with defensive realism is that it doesn't explain as much in the case studies that Copeland looks at. So it is a variable. States do think like this. Sometimes defensive realism is more important as a factor in the minds of politicians than future trade expectations. But across the universe of cases, from the time of Napoleon to the present, defensive realism explains less. The second conventional wisdom is liberalism, and this argues that states will remain at peace based on current benefits. And this is an argument by Cobden, who is a British member of Parliament and a major liberal theoretician, as well as British Prime Minister Gladstone. And this is the most common argument that is widely believed, and it doesn't have a lot of evidence. And the argument is that countries have certain trade benefits, and on the one hand there's the opportunity cost of losing the trade benefit, but more importantly there is the domestic structure that is affected by the fact that there's a certain amount of trade. So two countries are trading a lot, and they have a domestic system, a legal system that has an expectation of trade, and countries don't want to lose trade, and so they continue to interact. And so this has an opportunity cost type of argument where countries don't want to lose trade, so they maintain good relations. There's just not a lot of evidence for this. Countries certainly want the benefit of trade, and countries focus on current trade and past trade as a signal for what's coming in the future, but states are more affected by trade that they're anticipating in the future. And that just makes sense. You're looking for your future meal, not your current meal. The third conventional wisdom, which has the least evidence, is offensive realism. And offensive realism is not a realism built around the security dilemma, but realism around the idea that countries want power to survive, and you can never predict the intentions of other countries because their governments can change at any time. And for an offensive realist, it never makes sense to trade. Countries should never trade. So offensive realism is completely ill-equipped to predict why countries trade in the first place. For offensive realists, it's a pure mercantilist autarkic environment, and the theory fails to explain why countries trade. Copeland spends a lot of time focusing on the Marxist argument in each of his cases. The Marxist argument is that you have business lobbies that influence politicians, and this creates policy, particularly in imperialism in the late 19th century, the grab among Germany, France, and England for colonies in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. However, in almost every single case, there's no evidence for this. And the reason there's no evidence is that in the biographies of most of the politicians, they're above the business community, and they're almost always looking at the problem aggregately. It doesn't mean that they're not focused on the benefits of business. In the British Opium War, where the British attacked China in order to continue to sell opium into the Chinese market, in order to get the revenue so that they wouldn't end up with a huge trade deficit with China, that was very heavily economically driven. But the business people involved in the opium trade, many of them didn't receive compensation. The approach was aggregately, because the British government got a huge amount of tax from tea, And so that whole trade triangle with India, China, and England mattered from the standpoint of tax revenue. But the idea that you would have a business lobby influence politicians is very unlikely, because the different lobbies actually counteract each other. Some want higher tariffs if they want protectionism. Some want lower tariffs. And it's also very difficult from a collective action point of view to aggregate these lobbies. The train lobby, the energy lobby, the tech lobby, they in some ways cancel each other out. So it's a very attractive theory, but even in the case that is most driven by economics, such as the British conquest of the Transvaal in the Boer War, because of the enormous gold wealth located there, it was conducted by state actors, by politicians and bureaucrats, not by economic lobby groups. So in the cases where you'd most likely see a Marxist link, there isn't any. Now, a major concept for Copeland is trade security dilemma. The security dilemma is where two countries can worsen their security when trying to increase their security by acquiring power. The trade security dilemma adds trade to that equation, because when states become insecure in trade, they increase tariffs, and then they could build up fleets to go out and protect natural resources like food, oil, minerals, and fertilizer. So the reason the offensive realists are wrong and the defensive realists are right is because states are very sensitive to the impact of the trade security dilemma. So states engage in expensive domestic signaling through transparent legal practices. In other words, it's the theory of cosmopolitanism, where the laws that you pass in your own country apply both to the local business people as well as to foreigners coming into your country. And this guarantee assuages fears that a country will change a policy abruptly. Now, there are events like the 1929 stock market crash that ultimately led to the Great Depression, where it's difficult to predict what a government's going to do under those severe crisis situations. But the trade security dilemma is a serious threat to ongoing trade, and states therefore spend a considerable amount of political energy ensuring that it doesn't undermine the trade relations between states. And this is why the offensive realists are wrong. They don't predict that countries work hard to avoid the trade security dilemma. Copeland also makes a comment on mutual dependence. And we have this idea that one state is providing benefits like oil to another country, and therefore it's got a one-way influence. Hirschmann argued that states can also be powerful not because they provide resources, but because they're able to absorb resources in their market to the seller. And Copeland's point is that you want to look at mutual dependence as cutting both ways. The state that benefits more also has more to lose in a dispute, whether it's a supplier or a buyer. I mean, states need to be able to sell to their optimal market. Otherwise, they're getting much lower return. And this is why countries will sell oil to their adversaries, because the opportunity cost of selling to a country that pays less for those resources is significant. This is a mathematical formula, or rather an equation, of how you could look at the costs of losing trade. So if you have a country with 100 economic units for its economy, and it gets a benefit of 10 from trade, it then has a value of 110. But if post-trade, which is the loss of the trade and the economic shock of losing the trade, would reduce it down to 25, the opportunity cost is not 10, it's actually 15, which is significantly higher. Now, Copeland does identify when trade ends, and his theory doesn't explain when trade ends, except to say that there's a trade security dilemma that comes in as a shock. But he provides 6 specific circumstances where this is likely to occur, and these he finds evidence for in his case studies. So these are exhaustive. There might be others in different centuries, but for the period of 1800 to 2000, these are the 6 that emerge. So the first is a third-party event. This can often cause a shock that causes trade to drop. The U.S., for example, restricted oil to Japan in the lead up to Pearl Harbor, in part because they needed Japan not to attack the Soviet Union, and in part because the U.S. needed the oil to provide to the Soviet Union in order to fight Nazi Germany. A second case is third-party access, and this is repeated attempts by the Russians, the French, the English, the Austrians to influence, trade with, and get financial access to the Ottoman Empire. And very often this led to competition between countries that would cut off trade with each other. Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, was very important. British goods would come into the Black Sea from the Eastern Mediterranean and then go up the Danube all the way to the Austrian Habsburg Empire. Russian grain would come out of the port of Odessa through the Black Sea and down the other way to the Dardanelles. So this was a major transshipment point. And so all of the countries concerned had an interest in who was going to control Istanbul, even as the Ottoman Empire was fragmenting under the rise of nationalism during the 19th century. A third exogenous circumstance is third-party domestic events. Italy, after its unification, had a nationalist spurt where it wanted to recreate parts of the Roman Empire, and so it made a bid for control of Tunisia. And the French saw it as a vital concern because it was adjacent to their possession of Algeria, and so they intervened. And a consequence was a reduction in trade between Italy and France. A fourth exogenous circumstance is to stop trade, to stop growth of a potential adversary. And this was the U.S. Embargo of Soviet trade immediately after the Second World War that lasted more or less until the end of the Cold War in 1989, 1990, 1991. And it was essentially to deny the Soviet Union access to the technology that would have allowed them to add power to their economy. And this could have had a consequence to sustain communism in the Soviet Union. It could have encouraged the Soviet Union to engage against Western interests in the broader world at large. The fifth exogenous circumstance was depletion. The U.S. at the end of the Second World War, or even before, had correctly estimated that they were losing their self-sufficiency in oil. And so the U.S. had cut a deal with Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. saw Iran as a major security barrier against a Soviet entry into the Persian Gulf. And Iran was also able to provide oil for European economies. So here the U.S. had an interest in excluding the Soviet Union physically, and in fact there was a crisis in 1946 where the Soviet Union used its military presence to extract oil concessions from Iran that ultimately failed once the Soviets had left. The Iranians essentially denied the deal. But this had trade consequences for the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And the final exogenous circumstance is unit-level domestic politics, which is independent of the underlying economic situation. And this is what happened to Richard Nixon's regime in the 1970s. He had a 1972 trade deal with the Soviet Union. This was going to enhance trade and alleviate the Cold War's intensity through an improved détente relationship with Moscow. But because of Watergate, the Congress turned against Nixon, and they basically terminated the deal. And this ended Soviet détente. And the Soviet Union, basically, there was nothing they could do. It was beyond their influence. And it demonstrated to them the difficulty of interacting with a democracy, because it's so difficult to predict what the policy would be because of the constant change in government. So it's sort of ironic here. We think of offensive realism as trying to explain the capriciousness of authoritarian states, but in many ways it does a better job explaining the instability in policy of democracies. So here you can see a picture of the colonized world. And many of these states did provide strategic resources to the colonial powers. So let's look at the German case in World War I. We know already that Germany had unprecedented trade with England just prior to World War I that wasn't superseded until the 1970s. So what happened? Why would Germany go to war against its most important trading partner? So just prior to the First World War, Germany had a very high level of trade compared with other states at the time and even with the contemporary period. While states that traded made war in 1914, none that had significant foreign direct investment did. This was commonly a relationship between a colonial power and a colony in that period. There was the case of the French, who invested huge amounts into Russia to build the railroads there. Germany was one of the few states resisting protectionism at the beginning of the 20th century, due mainly to the fact that German industrial strength was growing very quickly and they needed to keep markets open in other countries. In 1895, England specifically cited the strong German export economy as a reason for it to review its free trade policy. In 1896, the British intruded on German investments in the Transvaal region in South Africa. And in 1897, England supported a Canadian decision to block non-British goods, which contravened the 1865 British-German Most Favoured Nation Status Agreement of 1865. In 1897, England, a declining hegemon, had begun shifting to a protectionist policy based on its empire to resist the rise of German exports. That same year, the Kaiser stated his belief that the British were seeking to weaken the German economy. The United States in the 1890 McKinley tariffs and France in the 1892 Melun tariffs also resisted German exports by raising tariffs to prohibitive levels. By the decade before the First World War, German dependence on imported oil was 90%. Between 1897 and 1913, Germany went from a net exporter of iron to importing 30% of its requirement. German trade to GNP ratio rose from 32% in 1900 to 30% in 1910 to 40% in 1913. While raw materials as a proportion of total imports increased from 41% in 1893 to 57% in 1913. Germany increased its ore imports from 60-fold between 1900 to 1913. But in 1912, France blocked any further German stake in French ore production. From 1890 to 1913, Germany's food imports grew 1% faster per year than the economy. Germany felt highly interdependent, and that over time it would be systematically excluded from other markets and sources of vital goods. The British and American exclusion of Germany from the 1898 Spanish-American War, the British and French exclusion of Germany from Africa during the 1905 and 1911 Moroccan crises, and the Anglo-Russian exclusion of Germany from Iran in 1909 seemed to reinforce the fear that Germany was being locked out from international commerce. In 1913, England and the US established their respective spheres of influence over Latin America and Middle Eastern oil. And this implied a British effort to stop German moves into the Middle East through the Ottoman Empire. This was despite the fact that England and Germany were each other's largest trading partners in the 30 years prior to the First World War. The result was that Germany was highly interdependent and stuck in a worsening economic situation, highly dependent on imports, but increasingly unable to pay for them as it was squeezed out of foreign markets and access to foreign raw materials. The German naval buildup in the 1890s and later was in part to protect Germany's merchant marine and to ensure that the British would not succeed in blockading Germany with their navy. Today, highly interdependent states such as Germany and Japan are integrated into an international trading system that works largely to satisfy their need for market access. What would happen, for example, if China were blockaded the same way the Soviet Union was during the Cold War? Now, this does not mean that all trade leads to war, as the Marxists would argue of capitalist trade. Trade is often used as an excuse for war, and these incidents should not be taken as evidence of anything regarding trade. For example, the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War was justified by the Yalu River dispute. Some argue that the Japanese and Russians initially began their clash, that ended in war over timber concessions that were of symbolic rather than actual economic value. In fact, the economic reason was a front for Japanese expansion. The Japanese had largely manufactured the economic dispute and even came to expect that the war would damage their economic interests. So these were excuses and not actual causes of the war. The war needed to be justified in economic terms to be seen as valid. One of the counterintuitive conclusions that can be applied empirically from Copeland's trade expectations theory is how the promise of trade, even when there's almost no trade, can have a huge impact on reducing the likelihood of conflict. And his interesting case is of the Cold War. There were actually 3 attempts at détente, which is sort of a restrained adversarial relationship between 2 great powers. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union sought trade in order to maintain its economic system. Early on, it was simply to increase the benefits to the population and to reduce the costs of having to maintain growth. But later, as the Soviet economy stagnated, particularly because it had very inefficient technology which required very high inputs to produce the same items like televisions or cars as compared with the West, there was an incentive to get access to the West and to get access to the Western technology. Now, immediately after the end of the Second World War, because communism was influential and the Americans were anticipating a post-colonial world where you'd have lots of new countries that would be susceptible to anti-European, anti-imperial ideology, and because in Europe you had economies that were devastated by the war, and you had labor movements that could have been influenced by communism, the US immediately took steps to effectively embargo the Soviet Union so that it couldn't benefit from trade that would add to its economic power. And this led to an enormous amount of resentment because only the USSR was asked by the US to pay back the Lend-Lease material provided it to defeat Nazi Germany, where the Soviet Union thought, we paid in blood, and the US is not asking any of its other Western European allies like England or France to pay back, so why would the USSR have to pay back? So the USSR sought trade for détente in the late 1950s, but ultimately it failed because US President Eisenhower was mostly focused on achieving second strike capability with missiles. In other words, the US had nuclear weapons, but they were vulnerable to a first strike. And so the political energy was on achieving second strike, and this was a lost opportunity. When it became apparent that détente had no prospect, you had an increase in the number of disputes between the Soviet Union and the Western countries, and this included the 1961 Berlin crisis and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a second attempt by the Soviet Union to obtain trade in exchange for détente, and that was in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And US President Richard Nixon acquiesced. He thought this was a very good idea, and so he pursued a policy within the US Congress of encouraging increased trade with the Soviet Union in order to obtain a reduction in the danger of the Cold War. And so there was actual cooperation that resulted from this initiative. There was an initiation of trade. There was a 1972 trade agreement, which reduced many of the restrictions on the exchange of equipment. And the Soviet Union reciprocated by assisting the U.S. Diplomacy in the Middle East, particularly during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. There were arms control agreements that were signed. The Soviet Union pressured Vietnam to sign the Paris Accords. And so there was a lot of cooperation. But then Watergate happened, which is a domestic scandal involving Richard Nixon's administration. The U.S. Congress turned aggressively against the Soviet Union, particularly picking a policy of the emigration of Russian Jews. And there was a consensus in the Congress to kill the 1972 trade agreement, basically by supplanting it with other agreements. And so American-Soviet trade dropped precipitously, and you had the beginning of a second Cold War in which the Soviet Union became more assertive in places like Angola, Nicaragua, Afghanistan. And it basically led to the U.S. response under President Ronald Reagan when he was elected in 1980 to pursue a large aggressive buildup. The third attempt by the Soviet Union to obtain trade was under Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev understood that the Soviet Union was severely economically constrained by the 1980s. It had a growth rate of less than 2%, in some years only 0%. So the Soviet Union desperately needed trade and technology. And Gorbachev also learned that Russia needed to go in the direction of democracy, even though he wanted to preserve socialism for its moral value. He also understood that the Soviet Union was not credible as a partner, and so the Soviet Union would have to take significant unilateral actions to convince the U.S. of their sincerity, and that the type of regime that Moscow was, a totalitarian communist system, was going to change. And one of his big acts was to allow the Warsaw Pact nations to collapse. And so this convinced Ronald Reagan. In fact, it convinced the U.S. president before that Soviet Union was being sincere, and trade was opened up very dramatically. And this was the key event that ended the Cold War. So here you can see the promise of future trade. The future trade expectations played a decisive role in a case where there was almost no trade. So this is an influential variable. The Indo-Pakistan War Scare of 1949 and 1950. The first Indo-Pakistan War Scare was in the years 1949 and 1950 and started over currency. Pakistan's refusal to go along with an Indian devaluation of the rupee in September 1949 led Pakistan to withhold the supply of jute, which is what we frequently use to create mats in the West, particularly when we're dealing with winter, from East Pakistan, which led in December to a cessation of Indian supplies of coal to Pakistan. The importance of the jute industry as an employer in both East and West Bengal, which are the two areas inside India and inside East Pakistan in Bengal, led to communal riots along religious lines and then large-scale ethnic migrations within just days. Essentially, Muslim Bengalis, resentful of Hindu economic dominance in East Pakistan, attacked them. In January 1950, Sardar Patel, the conservative co-leader with Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, warned of the danger of war facing Pakistan. In February, Nehru threatened Pakistan that other methods would be used if Pakistan did not control the communal rioting and Hindu refugees in East Bengal. On March 17th, in a speech given to the Lok Sabha, the Indian Parliament, Nehru warned that, quote, "If there is a grave danger to the minorities in Pakistan," referring to the Hindu Bengalis in East Pakistan, "it is quite impossible for us to look on and remain calm." There followed a deep, sharp rise in border clashes between India and Pakistan. In late February and March 1950, the Indian Army moved into West Bengal, and its 1st Armored Division, against which Pakistan had no counterpart, moved opposite Lahore. Military exercises, training for offensive operations, were carried out by the 3rd Armored Brigade at Nowshera and Kashmir in March. The Pakistan Army's reaction was to deploy its forces opposite the Indian Army in the Punjab. Now, Pakistan became fearful of Indian military action, and its willingness to provide concessions was motivated to a large extent by the serious military threats made by Patel. The crisis of communal violence in Bengal came to an end, and trade was resumed, and refugee property rights were established with the signing of the Delhi Pact by Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan, the Pakistani Prime Minister, on April 8, 1950. The Indian military forces were then withdrawn. Since the war scare of 1950, the Indo-Pakistani trade level went into steep decline and is today very low. And despite a number of public promises and free trade agreements by leaders on both sides to revive trade, there's been little attempt to reverse the situation. India and Pakistan are at a trade standstill, with illicit smuggling of trade that occurs through third parties like the United Arab Emirates, but very little direct state-to-state trade. Pakistan is essentially afraid that it would become economically dominated by India and has therefore resisted resuming trade. Frequently, the Regional Development Organization, SAARC, has proposed that Pakistan and India engage in large-scale trade. And these are frequently made calls. But in reality, Pakistan has consistently resisted large-scale trade with India for a very long time because it's aware that its vulnerability could lead to war or it being attacked. And Pakistan also looks at the example of Bangladesh, which has become heavily dependent on India. In fact, Bangladesh imports many of its goods not through the port of Dhaka, which is its capital, but through the port of Calicut, which is in India.